Okay. Thank you very much. The presentation today will have 3 parts. I'm going to show 2 short films, 17 minutes each, on 2 cities that we're working on, and then a PowerPoint in between. So just to give a little bit of context, both to the city design and to the housing that we've been doing lately. Both of them are under the umbrella, let's say, of believing that cities should be simultaneously magnets and dismantling devices for social and political time bombs. You may already know, it's already common knowledge, that today 50% of the population of the world is urban. And by 2050, 75% of the population of the world is going to be urban, which in principle is good news. It is good news because cities are magnets, are a force able to attract people, ideas, knowledge, opportunities, and because of that, cities are powerful vehicles to create wealth. The problem is that this process of people coming to cities is going to be at a scale and a speed that we haven't seen until today in mankind history. If today, out of the 3 billion people that are urban dwellers, 1 billion is under the line of poverty, by 2030, out of the 5 billion urban dwellers, 2 billion are going to be under the line of poverty. That creates the potential of cities to accumulate social pressure as if it was a social time bomb. But cities are potentially as well, if well designed, a dismantling device for social time bombs because cities are shortcuts towards equality. They can upgrade quality of life without having to depend on income redistribution, which is almost the only thing that we hear today while talking about inequalities in cities. So for you to get an idea, if we want to solve the problem of migration towards cities, we will have to build a 1 million people city per week with $10,000 per family for the next 20 years. If we don't solve this equation, it's not that people will not come to cities. They will come anyhow, but in this form, informally, in the form of slums. And this is what creates the potential of this accumulated social political pressure, but then we can use the same city design to be able to accommodate these people properly. We just finished last Sunday at the Venice Biennale a presentation we called exactly like this, the magnet and the bomb, making reference to this double condition of cities. So the 2 films you're going to see today are the ones that we just finished presenting at the Venice Biennale. One is about the reconstruction of a city after the 2010 8.8 Richter scale earthquake that we had in Chile, and the other one is a city for a copper mining industry in the Chilean desert. So what you see in the slides here is the way we presented on these wooden panels the physical plans and designs for buildings, infrastructure, public spaces, transportation for these 2 cities. As you see here in one example, this is the way we decided to show the projects. But then on top of these wooden panels, we projected the films that you are about to see in this way. So you will recognize in the films that I'm going to show right now that it's been projected on top of wood. it's trying to recreate what we're looking at there. Eventually, some of the projects that are being mentioned are not going to be seen because they were in the original exhibition, but still, it makes sense to show them because you can understand the history of these two projects. So we're ready to take a look at the first of the films, 17 minutes. Please show the first film.
Seguimos conociendo noticias. Último día de descanso o último fin de semana para relajarse porque ya comienza marzo.
¿Y se quedan hasta cuándo?
Hasta cuando me aburro, yo creo, po.
Hasta cuando las velas nada.
Ya,
vamos a comenzar este recorrido.
February 27th, 2010 was the last day of the summer holidays in Chile. But at 3:34 in the morning, an 8.8 Richter scale earthquake and tsunami hit the country. All the basic services collapsed. Water, food, electricity, shelter and communications were missing, producing a general state of panic and chaos. The earthquake triggered a social time bomb. Massive lootings and sackings of stores added huge social tension and a sense of insecurity to the collective fear of aftershocks and more waves. Elemental began to work right away, delivering solutions at different timescales. On day one, it was crucial to develop a more efficient system for water distribution. The collapse of the water grid forced the government to send cistern trucks to the affected areas. In order to make water collection more efficient, we proposed to make water roll instead of carrying it. The idea was to insert plastic bottles into a tire, allowing even a child to carry up to 25 liters at a time instead of less than 10, which was normally the case. On day two, the task shifted to deliver appropriate emergency shelters. Existing alternatives were small, of extremely poor quality, with no insulation, not even windows, so simply not good enough. Better quality solutions were necessary. We designed a 30 square meter insulated shelter with a set of panels that could be reused in the final housing solution. On day 30, we were called by forest company Arauco to get involved in Constitución, a 50,000 people city that was almost entirely destroyed. Arauco cellulose plant was the first to receive the impact of 12-meter-high waves coming from the north and was severely damaged. 6-meter-high waves found the river as a natural way to keep on moving into the continent. An island with old trees in front of the city, used as a vacation camping site, helped to reduce the magnitude of the waves. People ran to the hills to save their lives.
Yo trataba de agarrarme de alguna rama, de algún árbol, y no podía porque la electricidad que iba al agua no me dejaba agarrarme de nada. Y tuve que filmando al niño también, no podía hacer nada. Cuando salía a flote lo afirmé mejor. Si no se me soltó solo, menos lo iba a soltar yo.
But more than 100 persons were unable to do so and died, many of them in the same island that helped to protect the city.
Hay una imagen muy fuerte, es la cara del papá de mi capitán. y él miraba hacia como el horizonte, hacia el cuartel, hacia abajo, esperando llegar su hijo. Yo me recuerdo que fuimos a buscar con mi ayudante una motosierra rápidamente a la base 3 que yo había divisado, que necesitábamos poder abrirnos paso en algunos lugares, y veía a Carlos viejo esperando a su hijo, mirándolo, esperando que llegara a saber algo de él, porque su casa se había caído también. Entonces, como para decirle, Carlos, que en nuestra casa o qué estaba haciendo, él seguramente se lo imaginaba todavía a esa altura trabajando con los bomberos, sabía que era capitán. Y paso por el costado de él y nunca fui capaz de decirle. Era mi obligación como líder de decirle, su hijo falleció. No fui capaz.
Ha recorrido todo el río. El día entero ahora mismo ni almorzado. Está buscando algo. Es muy doloroso perder un hijo. El hijo y el papá.
Hijo único.
Llevo 3 días en la isla limpiándola. ¿Puedo encontrar algo? Nunca se... Hay que perder la esperanza de perder el hijo. Encontrarlo para enterrarlo. Ya no puedo ni dormir ya.
When people came down from the hills, they found that almost 80% of the city was destroyed. There was no idea of how or where to start with the reconstruction. Arauco, the main productive industry in the region, offered the government to help the city recover from the tragedy by donating a plan for a sustainable reconstruction. So, they called a group of professionals to elaborate a master plan for how to rebuild the city. Due to the emergency, we were given 100 days, which was almost nothing to think and design an entire city, but an eternity for the people living on the streets. So, we partnered with Tironi, a strategic communications company, to conduct the participatory design process at the entire city level. The first operation was to define a counterpart, a client, to guarantee the governance and feasibility of the operation. So, by day 32, a consortium composed by the government, the municipality, and Arauco Forest Company was already in place. By day 40, an open house, a physical space in the main square of the city for deliberations about the reconstruction to be conducted in the most public and civic way, was already built. In the meantime, in order to give the plan a deep sense of reality, we started to swallow, as fast as we could, every single constraint coming from the bureaucratic apparatus. By day 50, countless meetings had already been conducted with almost every public department that had a project for the city.
Cómo quiere la ciudad, ahora vota por constitución y vaya a la casa del PRES y exprese su opción. Participa a toda la comunidad, así que toda la comunidad.
Específicamente yo como pescador tengo 25 pescadores. ¿Dónde lo voy a llevarlo yo? ¿Al bosque?
Entonces, ¿por qué nosotros no podemos tener una defensa de hormigón? Por supuesto, bien hecho.
Soy historia de Constitución y vivo en mis actores. Y este señor me viene a decir que yo no puedo seguir viviendo ahí. Ha vivido toda mi familia, toda una vida ahí. Crié a mis hijos y mis hijos criarán a sus hijos. Y mis hijos y mis nietos y todo. Pero ¿por qué me viene a imponer usted? Él me está imponiendo. Mi zona de riesgo yo no puedo autorizar a construir. No, él mismo lo está diciendo.
We understood that for the people, even more disturbing than a potential future tsunami was the flooding that every single winter they had to suffer because of an inadequate city's drainage system. They also complained about the lack of public space, the traffic jams due to a narrow street grid, the disconnection between the city and the river, and many more. So, on day 51, only 20 days after having started to work in Constitución, we discussed 3 alternatives for how to protect the city against tsunamis, something unheard until then in Chilean urban design. The first alternative was to prohibit the reconstruction in the affected areas. This alternative was unrealistic and irresponsible. People, especially fishermen, would have installed themselves on ground zero anyhow, but in an informal way, transforming the area in an urban disaster. The second alternative was to build a huge wall towards the river to resist the impact of waves. The problem with this alternative was that trying to resist the force of nature is useless. A tsunami is not a series of big waves, but a displaced mass of water moving at 800 kilometers an hour. That is why heavy infrastructure proved useless in Japan in 2011. So we thought it was irresponsible to spend public money in a useless project. Our proposal was to have a forest to protect the city against future tsunamis. The idea was that against geographical threats, we had to offer geographical answers. We thought that instead of resisting the energy of the sea, we had to dissipate it by introducing friction. A public forest was politically more complex and socially more challenging, since it required land expropriation.
Bueno, eso es lo que estoy pidiendo. Se puede construir porque para mí ese parque, ¿de qué me sirve un árbol? En nuestra opinión, a mí el árbol no me, a menos yo sé que da aire, al menos lo he tenido antes, pero no me da a mí que comer.
But besides being an efficient mitigation device, it solved the problem of the flooding by laminating the rainwater. It also solved the historical debt in terms of public space, increasing it from 2 square meters to 7 square meters per inhabitant, providing democratic access to the river. To the proposed mitigation forest, we added a system of escape routes that within minutes could bring the population to a safe height in the hills, with photovoltaic public lighting that illuminated them even in case of electrical shortage. In order to give a coherent direction to the reconstruction, we also designed almost every public building, like the fire station, from where aid was coordinated. Or the bus terminal, a crucial building to re-establish connectivity. The school, which was where children could receive their meals. We also presented a set of typologies for the different housing policy programs. We applied our 10 years accumulated experience in social housing. For example, instead of doing the conventional 40 square meters small house, we proposed that 40 square meters had to be seen as half of a good house, allowing people to complete them over time. This way, emergency shelter panels could be included in the units, allowing people to achieve a middle income standard rather quickly and at a low cost. Together with Arauco, a new typology with a wood technology never used in the country before was developed, allowing us to build fast, affordable, and with an extraordinary seismic performance. The cultural center for the community to meet and rebuild their social network. The municipal theater, where all sorts of public events could be hosted to work as acts of collective healing. The wood cluster, a key element in the economic recovery of the city. Finally, we also reshaped many of the public spaces of the city, from the main square to the network of escape routes, to the tourist promenade along the Pacific Ocean. Given the scale of the operation, the scarcity of resources, and mainly the lack of time, on day 70, we asked the community to define the priority of problems to be addressed. In an exemplary civic act, 5,000 people went to the voting chambers and determined the buildings that had to be rebuilt first. The voting also validated the way the city was going to be protected against tsunamis. 94% of the population was in favor of the expropriations to create a mitigation forest. Even the fishermen agreed to be expropriated. They only asked to be allocated as close as possible to the river and to be treated equally. They were okay to leave if the wealthy landowners left too. On day 100, we submitted the proposal to the President of Chile. We are now around 800 days away from the earthquake. Some of the projects may never be executed the way we proposed them, but it is a fact that the city will move its gravity center from the grid of streets to the river, to a new public space that will repair the urban depth of the city, that will solve the historic problem of the flooding due to rain, and that will simultaneously protect the city against future natural threats, introducing for the first time in Chilean history a new anti-tsunami urban DNA. So in both cases, Constitución and Calama, the water was the problem, too much in one case, too little in the other. And in both cases, trees were the solution, protecting the city from a water overdose by dissipating the energy of a tsunami in one case, and domesticating a harsh environment due to water scarcity in the other. In both cases, we used city design as a force able to attract people, knowledge and development, trying to capitalize cities as powerful vehicles to create wealth. And in both cases, we used city design as a dismantling device for social time bombs, taking advantage of cities' potential to be shortcuts towards equality.
So we can go back to the PowerPoint, please. We arrived here to do a city, not that we ever thought that we could have been given such a thing, because we started doing social housing. By doing social housing, we were working for the workers of this forest company, and then when the tsunami hit in 2010, they say, why don't you propose something for the entire city level? We were doing infrastructure, public space, transportation in other projects, but for the first time we had to do all of them simultaneously. But the beginning of all that, and actually an important part of the plan that it's needed to be said, all the buildings you saw there are under construction now. The park has already been expropriated, so it will begin to happen from now on. It will take 10 years until the trees grow. But the project is already under construction. But it started here in social housing. So about social housing, I would like to say the following. All of us, and I would assume that here in Russia, that's pretty much the case for the majority of the people. If you're a middle-class family, 80 square meters, it's fine to live in. If there's money, be it private or public, you normally are fine if you're able to achieve 80 square meters. But what if there's no money? That's pretty much the case for the majority of the world. What the market tends to do when there's no money is two things: displace and reduce. Displace means buying land where it costs nothing. And reduce is to squeeze the size of the unit until you can pay for the available amount of be it a subsidy or whatever form of public policy. And I'm talking about, in average, 40 square meters in the best of the cases. So when there's no money, what the market does is to reduce the size to do smaller houses. We thought this was not the right approach. So what we did as reframing the problem at the very beginning was, what if 40 square meters, instead of being considered a small house, are considered half of a good house? Half of a good house, instead of a small one, is another way to say incremental housing. And this is not new. We have known incremental housing since the 70s. And I'm talking about, when I talk about 40 square meters, that in average, the majority of the world has to provide housing solutions for about $10,000, $15,000, and that's why you get 40 square meters. So reframing the problem of scarcity as half of a good house instead of a small one was our way to enter the problem, designing the question before designing the answer. So if incremental housing is not new, half of a good house, we thought it was new. It's not half of a house, it's half of a good house. So once you frame the problem as half of a good house instead of a small one, the key question is, which half do we do? And we thought that with public money, we had to do the half that a family will never be due on their own, individually. We identified 5 design conditions that belong to the half that a family will never be able to do on their own. So that is one point about housing. The second point is that houses should be the opposite of cars, meaning that if cars decrease its value over time, houses should gain value over time. And this, unfortunately, is not the case in social housing. Every day that goes by, the value of the property goes down. And there's no reason why social housing shouldn't perform the way we all expect it to be when we buy a house. When all of us, when buying a house, almost by definition, expect it to grow its value over time. In the case I'm talking about, we started in Chile, but again, this is pretty much the case. It was discussed in the morning, in a policy that is property-oriented. That means that once a poor family gets a subsidy, they become owners of the house. Housing is the biggest trespass of public money into a family asset. And one would like that individual private asset to gain value over time, so that that family can use their household as a tool to overcome poverty. We identified 5 design conditions that can expect a house unit gain value over time. And if you remember, these are exactly the same 5 conditions that a family cannot do well on their own individually. If that happens, that housing gains value over time, we will be looking at the housing policy as an investment and not just as a social expense. And in that way, we may look at housing as this tool against poverty and not just as a shelter against the environment. So with this in mind, I'm talking about 2003, we were given our first project. And the problem was to find a solution for 100 families using a subsidy of $7,500, with which we had to buy the land, provide the infrastructure, and build the house, which in the best of the cases meant about 30 square meters. So we needed to find a solution for these 100 families that were occupying illegally for the last 30 years a piece of land of half an hectare, 5,000 square meters. To solve the equation, we knew we had to do something that was in between a building making an efficient use of land, and a house able to grow over time. Somewhere in the middle was the solution. The task was to leave these families in the place where they were, because despite very bad living conditions, problems of public health, but also of drug traffic, despite all these problems, the city around was highly desirable to be maintained because it offered the network of opportunities poor families needed. The problem is that the market already knew that this part of the city concentrated opportunities. It was said in the morning that a good social housing project or any project is the one where within half an hour you can find jobs. Well, this was the case for these families, but the land cost was 3 times more than what social housing can normally afford. So with the families, following the same participatory design process, actually the other way around, we always did a participatory design that then was scaled up to the entire city level. And by participation, we meant this. This is exactly the same PowerPoint we were showing to the families, not just in English, in Spanish. But we were trying to test, okay, if you are expecting a detached unit, isolated houses, where we can fit only 30 units in the half-an-hectare site. 70 families will have to leave, but the real problem was that if we put together all the $107,000 subsidies, we were not even able to buy the land. Even if we got the land for free by a philanthropist, for example, the problem with isolated units is that they're unable to control growth. And we knew that these units were going to double the size. Somewhere on the very right end above, you see the roofs of some units built some time ago that was swallowed by self-construction. So the quality of the neighborhood went down again, and the value of the properties went down with the units. So this was not an alternative. We then tested another existing typology in the market, the row houses, which meant that we were slightly more efficient, 60 families, still not enough. But the problem with this is that whenever you wanted to grow, you blocked kitchens and bathrooms, or you had to go through a room to arrive to the newly built room. So instead of efficiency in the land use, what we get was overcrowding. So this was not an alternative either. Finally, let's go up. A high building, well, here you have much higher buildings. In the case of Chile, we have 3 stories, 4 stories, up to 5 stories, because they do not need an elevator. We could fit the 100 families, but the families threatened us to go to a hunger strike if we even dare to offer this as a solution, because there was no space to grow. This is by far the typology that has the more social conflicts. So that's why families were absolutely against this alternative. So none of the existing alternatives in the market was a possibility. So we had a problem, and we had to innovate. And the first thing we did was to reframe the question once again. Instead of looking for the best $7,500 unit to be replied 100 times, we asked ourselves, what is the best $750,000 building, and ask these building conditions, host families and their growth. The problem with the building is that they cannot grow. That's true, except on the ground floor and the upper floor. So what we did was a building that only had the ground and the upper floor. And we multiplied the building so that at least 50% of the urban front was designed and controlled by us, and then allow families to build the next half on their own over time without sacrificing the quality of the urban neighborhood. This is the specific design. Houses on first floor able to achieve 72 square meters, so middle class standard. Duplex apartments on top, able to achieve 72 square meters as well, with individual access to upper properties. We eliminated every single collective device because nobody maintained that. And that's a big reason for why value goes down. No maintenance capacity of a poor environment. And then expect families to grow in the voids that we left in between. We used every single tool available, from PowerPoints to models, workshops, asking families to write and draw how they were imagining the project to verify if we were on the same page or not. So this is how family imagined their project was going to look like. I'm talking about 2004 now. The alternative was this. With $7,500, this is what the market was offering, not just a very bad building quality, but mainly it was located 45 minutes away in almost a different city where land cost nothing. And we wanted to have people in the same city center where land costs 3 times more. So this is what we redesigned, and since families did not lose their jobs, they began the process of achieving the next half and the middle class standard right away. If the first half of the unit cost $7,500, the second half cost to the families in average $1,000. And the sum of the two is at least $20,000 according to market pricing today, not us. I mean, if they go to the market, this is the value of their property, mainly because of location. So in order to pay, for example, for structure for the final scenario, which is very high in the list of what families cannot do on their own, we had not to do something. And this was part of the negotiation with the families. No payments, no painting, because that is easily achievable. And actually, we will never be able to customize the solutions the way families would have preferred. The same thing for the duplex. So what we were looking for, low-rise density, without overcrowding, with the visibility of expansion. This is what we're trying to test in every single design that we do. And with that in mind, in 2003 and 2004, we did that. And then we kept on building along the Chilean territory, testing different geographical conditions. Middle cities, big cities, from the north, in the desert in the north, to Patagonia in the south. The design had to change because the upper part of the country is hot. So the half of the house, let's say, was the left one, and we then left the right one to be completed. In the south of the country that is cold, the half that we did was the outer half, and then allowed families to complete it inside. So for you to have an idea, Chile goes from Moscow to Mumbai. And this is the range of geographical conditions that we were trying to cover while building in Chile. And also, we then went to test other conditions, but with the same approach for Brad Pitt's foundation in New Orleans, with much more money, but always with the same approach, half of a good house instead of a small one. Or in Monterrey, in Mexico. Testing prefabrication in Milan, in Italy. Or for a private developer in Switzerland. So all this knowledge has been recently condensed in the form of a book that was launched in the Venice Biennale. And actually you see here that we wanted to make the point even without reading the book. So somewhere there, what we're trying to do is have that families do on their own, partners with what we are doing ourselves, and then the sum of the two is what we expect it to be, the private-public partnership. I mean, the most radical way of understanding private-public partnership. So with this in mind, we scaled to the city level of reconstruction, and following that model, we were asked 1 year ago by the copper mining industry, which produces the wealth for the country, to intervene in an entire city. So let's take a look at the second film, 15 minutes, and then we go back to some conclusions. Can you lower the light maybe here? We don't need the light.
Chile's main source of income is copper. Calama, a 150,000 people city, is the core of the copper production, and Codelco, the Chilean Copper Corporation, is the main actor in town. In order to coordinate and channel in an efficient way the resources invested in the community, Codelco called Elemental to develop a participatory urban plan following the model used in Constitución after the 2010 tsunami. Once again, as in Constitución, we partnered with Tironi, a strategic communication company, to conduct the participatory design process. On June 28, 2011, we flew to Calama to present our strategy. That night, on our way out of Calama back to Santiago, as if it was a sign of the time to come, we crossed the riot squad entering the city. The government was moving their pieces to resist a social tsunami. On June 29, 2011, thousands of people took the streets of Calama. The press was reporting that as much as 1/4 of the town's population, with the support of the mayor, threatened to block the access to the mines and stop the copper production, which meant a major risk for the political and economical stability of Chile. Given the evident urgency, we proposed to Codelco to come up with a set of projects in 100 days to decompress the social pressure. We called it Calama Plus, which stood for Urban Sustainable Plan. Calama is a 12,000 years old Andean oasis located in Atacama, the driest desert in the world. 1 millimeter of rain every 20 years, 3,000 meters above the sea level, 40 degrees of temperature variation between day and night, strong winds and dust coming from the desert, and the highest UV radiation on Earth mean that the city has to live under one of the most extreme environments that one can imagine. No wonder people were complaining about the unevenness between the wealth they produce for the country and the poor living conditions they had to bear in such a remote place. But something was different in Calama. When analyzed more carefully, people's demands were looking for beauty, friendliness, and dignity for the city. Some authorities dismissed these demands as soft and non-basic. For us instead, it was clear that we were facing a new scenario, a second generation of more sophisticated and harder to respond questions. Our first move was to create a counterpart, a consortium that brought together all the stakeholders. In parallel, we built the open house in the main square, a physical place where deliberations on the future of the city could be conducted in the most public and civic way. In order to gain time, we avoided starting from scratch and made a rigorous survey of all the existing projects that were already admitted in the public investment system. But on August 29, 2011, a second strike, even more massive, stopped the city once again. The mayor was arrested for leading the manifestations and blocking the roads. The dialogue between the central government and the municipality was interrupted. Political tension added to the social one, threatening the whole operation. It took several weeks and a very delicate political surgery to re-establish the confidence between the members of the consortium. But on November 18, 2011, a symbolic milestone took place: the official inauguration of the open house in the main square. So, we thought, given the political conflict was over, we could now move forward more smoothly. We were wrong. As soon as we started to meet with the community, we found a level of resentment, skepticism, and even rage never witnessed before in our professional life. Every single possible polarity was in conflict here. The municipality and the regional government represented opposite political factions, so left versus right. The national problem of embarrassing inequalities was present here in an even more radical way, so poor versus rich. Given that human habitation was only possible around the Oasis, two modes of settlement and production were fighting to prevail: urban versus rural. And what proved to be the most complex one, two cultures and cosmogonies collided here: Westerners versus natives. We experienced these polarities in the form of a constant rejection and criticism of whatever we did.
Primero, a mí me preocupa de que este evento sea en un lugar tan inhóspito como este y que el showroom que tienen para el Calama Plus sea de estas mallas Rachet. A mí me parece que ya por ahí parte la falta de respeto para Calama.
Para mí esto es una farándula que están haciendo ustedes, porque aquí yo estoy aquí presente con los cabros profesionales de aquí de Calama, que ellos se dan cuenta realmente cómo es la lógica de Calama, que a nosotros nos están echando de aquí de Calama, nos están corriendo de Calama, y ustedes están pensando en hacer una cosa para los niños chicos, cuando aquí nosotros lo que necesitamos son profesionales, porque estas mineras prácticamente le quiero que le cierran los ojos a la gente. ¿Para qué? Para que no tenga la educación o la sabia cordura de decir, de mirar una visión de 10 años más para Calama.
Tengo una persona que pertenece al grupo de usted que me está agrediendo permanentemente mientras yo hablo.
Ramón, a ver, acá todos quieren, hay más personas que quieren hablar.
¿Este señor quién es?
Hay más personas que quieren hablar. Te pediría que cierren la idea.
Voy a cerrarla al tiro. Voy a cerrarla al tiro. Primero, me parece sumamente extraño que un miembro del equipo de usted me esté agrediendo mientras yo estoy hablando, intentando confundir. Constantemente aquí testigo habla. En consecuencia, con esto termino. ¿Saben qué? Estas cosas que ocurren generan definitivamente desconfianza. Y yo denuncio que este proyecto está calcado para la minería y favorece a la minería y no a Calama. Muchas gracias.
Le falta la parte espiritual a Calama. Está creciendo como un cuerpo canceroso. Y mientras nosotros no nos preocupemos de una universidad para Calama, yo le digo, nosotros vamos a seguir creciendo así como un cuerpo canceroso. Aquí los únicos que ganan plata son las transnacionales mineras, son las empresas que vienen de afuera a hacerse millonarios a costa de los trabajadores de esta ciudad.
Varias veces han venido a proponer peritas, han venido a poner tortitas y todas las cosas a Calama y después se van. Entonces aquí en Calama hay un resentimiento social, hay una desconfianza.
On December 12, 2011, a first proposal was made to the community in a massive town meeting. We proposed to transform Calama in the best connected city in the country to compensate the isolation and remoteness. A communications tower able to work as the new postcard of the city was presented. The train, transporting industrial freight through the city, was replaced by a light rail public transportation system, and a new shade standard was introduced in the public spaces. This plan was almost entirely rejected. We went then into a series of workshops and hybrid forums. We discussed a system for protecting the city from the wind and dust using some hallowed towers on top of an artificial hill. The idea was to accelerate the wind in between two plates, shifting its direction in 90 degrees, creating a kind of wall of air. But after consulting several experts and running some simple wind models, our intuition proved to be wrong. The wind just skipped the towers instead of going through them. People also said that the slope looked too industrial, and they were looking for architectural language that was more local. So we went to the high plateau in the Andes to study the irrigation system of the old terraces as a way to create a green filter able to retain dust. People immediately felt that this was heading in the right direction. We also shifted the discussion from the shade to the question of water. Who owned it? Who was using it? How much will be missing in the near future?
Permítame decir que yo estoy en desacuerdo con esto porque no se atañe la cosa puntual. Aquí nosotros tenemos un problema grave del agua. El agua se pidió el año 90, se pidió que se declarara seco el río Noa y hasta el minuto no pasa nada. Hablan de sustentabilidad en el tiempo, pero uno hace y no es sustentable en ningún tiempo si no hay agua.
Exigimos a las mineras que traigan agua de mar y que devuelvan el agua a su cauce del río Noa. Muchas gracias.
So 10 days after the first town meeting on December 22nd, 2011, a second proposal was submitted to public discussion in the main square. What proved to be the most important outcome of that second town meeting was that we started the presentation that night by addressing what people called the historical debt with Calama. December 22nd, 2011 was a pivotal point in the project because by showing the 4 urban plans that were done for the city since 1998, georeferencing the projects that were executed, but also the ones that never happened, skepticism and rage began to dissolve. By acknowledging for the first time what was considered as broken promises, people felt that the discussion was honest and that we were all finally standing on a common ground. So that night, just before Christmas, we synthesized the vision for the city in 2 points. We had to implement a geographical environmental operation more than an urban one, to expand the Oasis condition from the river to the entire city in order to domesticate its environment. And second, we had to transit from the current mining camp condition to a proper city by upgrading the civic character and urban standard of the settlement. For expanding the Oasis, we proposed 4 operations. First, we resorted to the old Andean techniques of terrace irrigation to stop the drought of the agricultural belt. Second, we proposed to plant a forest with native species in the ravine to the north in order to reduce the dust coming into the city. Third, we proposed to use the water of the treatment plant to create a linear park. Accumulated to the highest point in town in a big cistern, and by gravity distributed through a major aqueduct. The aqueduct will then feed the trees' irrigation system in all the streets. To transform a mining camp into a proper city, we intervened public spaces and proposed public buildings in 2 areas. Along a linear center crossing the city from the north to the south and in the periphery to the west. Along the central boulevard, we placed many urban services and amenities. For the periphery, we proposed to intervene the public schools, adding a wider programmatic offer so they could serve neighborhoods as community centers. On April 3rd, 2012, we held the third massive town meeting where all the projects were shown. Once again, it was not an easy task. Resentment was still there despite months of intensive dialogue.
Claro, a la gente no se le puede estar induciendo cómo votar, ni aunque se le diga que se le va a educar. Así que hay que tener cuidado. Esto partió mal.
Tengo pleno conocimiento de lo que aquí se está haciendo. Y esto evidentemente nadie se puede decir que es feo. Como diría cualquier mujer, esto es como ir al salón de belleza, a embellecerse un poco, a maquillarse un poco. Este proyecto contiene eso. Porque la verdad es que no es ningún aporte por la deuda social inmensa que tiene la minería y que tienen todos los gobiernos que han pasado por aquí, por Calama, y especialmente los municipales.
Este lunes 12 de diciembre a las 18:30 horas en la plaza 23 de marzo, los calameños que queremos una mejor comuna para vivir, nos reunimos en el primer foro ciudadano de Calama Plaza.
We entered the most ambitious part of the participatory process, a public referendum to establish priorities among the projects and give social and political weight to the plan. Authorities were skeptic. From the 12th until the 14th of April 2012, 25,000 people went massively to vote. This represented 50% of the city's entire voting universe, which gave the project a huge civic democratic momentum. So, in both cases, Calama and Constitución, the water was the problem. Too much in one case, too little in the other. And in both cases, trees were the solution to protect the city from a water overdose in one case, dissipating the energy of a tsunami, and domesticating a threatening environment due to water scarcity in the other. In both cases, we used city design as a force able to attract people, knowledge and development, trying to capitalize cities as powerful vehicles to create wealth. And in both cases, we used city design as a dismantling device for social time bombs, taking advantage of cities' potential to be shortcuts towards equality.
So we can go back to the PowerPoint. So in the case of Calama, it was particularly relevant that not just the social conflict we were trying to solve, but the mining industry needs to bring 10,000 qualified workers, and unless the city has enough quality, they're not willing to come despite the salaries that they get. And this is a major threat for all the major productive companies in the country. That's why voting how to improve the quality of the city and have political backup was so crucial. While being in Venice on, it says somewhere there, August 14th, this project received an award from the Ministry of Development, and the very next day, the President decided to give priority for funding the projects in the city. What is crucial in both cases is that the real scarce resource in cities is not money. It's first of all coordination, and second, synthesis. Cities, if anything, require a transversal coordination. Everything, every move, every project that you do in the city is simultaneously public space, infrastructure, it affects the quality and value property. And Chile is not prepared in the investment system to do that level of coordination. So by far coordination is a scarcest resource. Second, the more complex the question, the more need for synthesis. What is the point of a city? Can we, when designing a city, describe it in one single sentence, even more, one single word? So Constitución is about a forest against geographical threats, geographical answers. Calama is about an oasis. This is important because a city is not an accumulation of houses. A city is a concentration of opportunities. On the one hand, it's a powerful vehicle to create wealth, and on the other hand, it's a shortcut towards equality. So with this in mind, what about Moscow? I just arrived yesterday, of course, and been listening to the presentations here. And in a dinner, the first day I arrived, somebody asked me, is it true that you perceive Moscow as a cold, exotic, and lots of money around? And I said, yes, it has all that. I would replace, though, cold by cool, exotic by avant-garde, and lots of money around by powerful. But what you're not saying, and as an outsider, what I see here as a potential for the city is that Moscow, looking at it from the other side of the world, what comes to your mind is that it used to be, or at some point, there was an imperial scale, an empire. The second thing is literature. What about that? Well, an empire is about monumentality. Literature is about the soul, as somebody said, Simon Anholt said yesterday, actually. If you have been an empire, in your DNA is the capacity to tackle big questions. If you do have a strong literature, in the DNA is the capacity to tackle deep questions. So by having been an empire, if there's anything remain of that, is the capacity of having coordination, of being able to, whenever you do an operation, is not a single thing, but it could become, at least potentially, a network of things, a net that can cover a territory. On the other side, if there's anything in literature, is the capacity to provide introversion, not isolation, introversion. So then the scale of the empire is able not just to produce monuments, but it's able to deal with geography. And literature, if well treated, can produce quality interiors. And I guess as a consequence of that, if you add all those things, at least potentially, you have the capacity to do and implement and work and operate at the mega city scale simultaneously with the human scale. Thank you so much. If there's any question, I'm happy to answer.
Maybe I missed it, or maybe you didn't say it, but how did the people in Calama vote? What did they tell you in this referendum?
Again?
How did the people in Calama vote? Did they vote for the project that you proposed, or did they vote it down? And what did you actually do there already? What was already built in Calama by December 2012? Thank you.
So if I understood correctly, what did the people vote for?
Yes, in this poll that you were conducting
yes.
This April.
So for all the months that we worked in Calama, we were trying to agree what to do. And I don't know if you saw that part of the presentation. We brought the first proposal of what to do. It was completely rejected. Second proposal, half of it rejected and fine-tuned. And finally, we were able to say, well, this city should be about domesticating the environment, so a geographical operation more than an urban one, an oasis at the entire city level, and then change the mining camp condition to a proper city. Do we agree on that? And people mainly said yes, and this was in any imaginable participation forum, workshop, whatever we did. So when we thought we had an understanding with the community, with the government, and with the private companies, because all these needs to be funded. So as soon as the community was okay, and the government said this is technically possible and we can pay for that. I'm talking about $700 million. 70% of that is funded publicly, 30% of that by private companies that were okay as well. We went to the poll to establish a priority. What do you think needs to build first? because such an operation will only be possible over the next 12 years. So we needed to start somewhere. And the people, it was two goals. First, establish priorities. But the real reason was to communicate to the central government that people cared about this. Having 50% of the entire city voting universe was a huge signal to the political power so that this cannot be dismissed. The threat was, as you may have seen, there were 4 urban plans before. We didn't want to be the 5th that just remained as drawings. So the political, social energy channeled, even in the form of a threat, was very crucial so that it could have the funding that this would require. A side goal not declared is that in cities there's a major threat, which is that any major change happens in periods of time that are much longer than the administrations that politically rule them. Whatever you want to do in a city, if it's significant, will take a decade. I don't know what's the case in Russia, but the municipality chooses mayor every 4 years. We change president every 4 years, and we cannot re-elect the president. So if you have the community participating, and they feel that they're authors of the proposal, and actually they did, they rejected some and adjusted one, they're going to be the only ones there when the mayor changes and when the president changes. So to give continuity, it's another major purpose of having participation. At this point in Chile, this is not really a choice. The democratic approach has to be done. You may have known about Chile, students' riots, major opposition for energy projects. And the country has been growing economically. We have tripled our income in 10 years, and politicians ask, why is people complaining? We're 3 times richer. Looks like this is still not enough. So the participation, it's now mandatory, but there's a very important reason that to give continuity to plans that otherwise won't produce any major change in the city.
But this poll was seven months ago. What has been actually built since then in Calama? Since the polls in April, what has been built?
Well, the poll was in April, but in August, the funding were approved to have this plan as the way to channel private and public funding. The next phase we went into was to take the projects that were in the priority, the park and some of the public buildings, and went from schematic design to design development and engineering. And this is what we're doing right now. We're working in the 4 more crucial projects to make it become approved by the budget of 2013. So what we got was a navigation card to move from the idea to the reality. And this is at the point that we are at today.
Was working at a density of 100 tenements per hectare.
Again, I can't hear.
The first project that you showed, where incremental housing was built, it was working on a density of 100 tenements per half a hectare. That means 200 tenements per hectare at the density. Suppose if the density were to be 500 tenements per hectare, the existing density, how would you work out the incremental housing within that context? Does such context exist in Chile?
I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but the starting point was 100 families in half an hectare. So 400 people in half an hectare, 800 inhabitants per hectare. That was the density.
If the density were 4 times higher in a given scenario, how would you do incremental?
We had to at least cope with that density. For you to have an idea, Santiago is a city that has 95 inhabitants per hectare. social housing projects do have 200 inhabitants per hectare, and this project was 800 inhabitants per hectare. What the experts were expecting was high-rise. And what we did, knowing that this will lead to a social failure because of the need of maintaining elevators and elevated circulations that nobody pays for, we had to achieve such a density in low-rise. By low-rise, I mean at the most, one property on top of the other. Somebody in the morning said, well, we are looking for low-rise density in Moscow, 8 to 12 floors. That's not even close to our notion of low-rise. So enough low-rise so that each family can have individual access to that. With 800 inhabitants per hectare, we're 10 times above the average of our cities. And I would say that that's more than enough as an achievement. Otherwise, you're so far away. I mean, imagine that when we said that for the same amount of money, we can improve density by 10 times. Or that we could pay land that was 3 times more expensive. Everybody said, yeah, sure you can. So when we built the thing, then they said, yeah, but the city in the north does not have a rain. So then we built all around the country. And then the question was, yeah, but maybe now Chile is too rich. What about the rest of the world? So you never end up cutting the reasons why people shouldn't believe you, and that's why we need to prove the thing by building projects. And so we haven't got beyond that density, but more than that, we don't care about density. What we care is about height. Can we, for poor environments, provide a solution that doesn't require maintenance of the common space? That's the question.
I was only asking from the limited perspective. So I come from Mumbai. We are at the moment building a massive housing program from the government side where the density is 10,000 persons per hectare. We are building 160 square feet tiny apartments of 1 room for the lower economically weaker section people. So we are going very, very high-rise, of course, which is generally not rejected in Mumbai by the poor also. But I was only trying to guess if you have, you are planning to move to other places and try to also find some way of giving an opportunity to the poor people in high-density areas.
Yes.
Also, probably the principle can still be used in some way in other.
As you remember, the triangle was low-rise density without overcrowding, with the possibility of expansion. This triad can follow many different designs. I don't know if it's possible to achieve that for 10,000 people per hectare. I don't know. But we didn't know if we knew at the beginning. So might be. It just requires time and thinking about the thing. We already moved to Mexico, for example, which was a different scenario. And what we're trying to do now, more than the density, we're focusing on less money. Can we do something that instead of $10,000, it's $5,000, it's $1,000? And we do have designs for, instead of moving up, moving even farther, not down, but closer to the core. This is actually the name of what we do. Elemental is when you cannot further compress something, that it cannot further be decomposed. It's the irreducibility of a problem. So going down in money means you need to go even closer to the core of architecture. Well, we are almost, maybe one more question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the lecture, and I would like to ask you, do you have any further future plans? Because, you know, in Soviet Union we had this social housing that was Khrushchevka's, that now they are expired, they do not fit to the contemporary lifestyle, and we don't have any plan with what to replace them. And what you have proposed, that people will have loans, they will pay for like 20 years, even more, building their own houses. And and in 20 years, maybe it won't fit to their lifestyle. Do you have any further plans? Is it like temporary housing or for next 100 years?
Again, I cannot listen very well to the loudspeaker from here, but you said that if this will last enough or is a kind of temporary thing.
Well, yes.
From what point of view? From the material point of view or from the social standard point of view?
Well, if you can elaborate on both sides, that would be great.
Well, since this is a property-oriented policy, we expect, and actually this is what happens, that when you become an owner, the notion of value gain, many people say that this is too sophisticated for the poor people to understand. One of the things that they got immediately was that if they have a household that gains value over time, their children will benefit from that because they can go to the banking system and ask for a loan to start a small business or a cab, for example. So it improves the family income, and they want their children to benefit from that. I would say that, as in any city, the material quality is not what defines the longevity of a process. It's more the social, economical force staying in that place or not. And by allowing people to stay close to the network of opportunities, the chances of that part of the city to run down are close to zero. I mean, every day that goes by, those part of the city become more and more appreciated. So from a social point of view, that could be another way to look at these things. Since community was involved from the beginning, and since we had some very specific design tools involved. Example, maximum amount of families per courtyard, slightly backwards. If you are poor, it is very expensive to be poor, because you have to go and buy sugar of 1/8 of a kilogram. That's why poor families tend to associate themselves in what is called extensive families. Parents, children, grandparents, uncle, relatives. So you create a broader network that it happens spontaneously in slums. You should be able to achieve that scale that is somewhere in between the public, streets, and the private, the lot. So in between the two, the private lot, today, cities do have a binary structure. It's either private or public. In between the two, we introduce an intermediate level of association, which is the collective. Call it a condominium. The maximum size of that is around 20 families. Beyond that, social agreements cannot be maintained. And this could be a high-rise building or could be a community. If you do not know who is who in your neighborhood, it is much harder to achieve and maintain agreements over time. So the social permanence of these things is connected to design in the capacity of targeting exactly what can produce the benefit of the collectiveness and not the problems of the collective. So building quality, I don't think is going to, we built in Chile, and maybe that's one of the few good things about earthquakes. We had in 1960 a 9.5 earthquake. In 2010, an 8.8 earthquake. 8.8 is 500 times stronger than Haiti. So unless you prepare your buildings for that, it won't survive the next earthquake. So the material quality is already tested. And actually people do not die from earthquakes. They died from the tsunami, and that was a new thing. So material quality is good enough to resist nature. What is more threatening is the social, on the one hand, but the economical improvement of the country. By having tripled the income in 10 years, now people, what used to be enough is not enough anymore. The biggest challenge in the country, despite Chile is a country of $20,000 per income per year, per family, per capita. So we're somewhere close to the poorest countries in Europe, Portugal or something like that. And that was not the case 10 years ago. Despite being a poor country, the newspaper title today, if you look in Chile, is that we're demolishing social housing. We haven't even solved the problem of the deficit, and we're already demolishing what was built 10 years ago. So we do have the problem of not creating lasting enough projects. And this, for us, was one kind of condition, but that was not very conscious. It was a side effect of what I would call the ultimate quality test, which is, instead of numbers of density of all the public policy parameters and standard, all that, the ultimate question that we were following was, would I live this here? If I could live here, then maybe it's enough. So if that question is answered positively, it may last for what is required for the future generations.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you. Oh, that's fine.